It was a quiet evening on a well-manicured suburban street, the kind of place where neighbors wave politely and the hum of crickets fills the air. But tonight, the serenity was interrupted. Red and blue lights bounced off the windows of parked cars as a police cruiser came to an abrupt stop. Dr. Dashay Reed sat behind the wheel of her sleek black sedan, her face calm but her hands gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter than usual. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, pulled over again. As the officer approached her car, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanned her vehicle with an expression that could only be described as judgmental. He knocked on the window, sharp and deliberate, his tone leaving no room for doubt about his assumptions. "License and registration," he barked. Dr. Reed turned to face him, her calm gaze meeting his. At that moment, there were no raised voices, no sudden movements, just the heavy silence of two very different worlds colliding. What happened next would not only change the officer's perception, but also become a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. How do you confront prejudice when it stares you in the face? And what happens when the person you misjudge has the power to expose your deepest flaws? Before we get into this story, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for daily new stories. Officer Carter had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the same neighborhoods. To him, the experience was a substitute for understanding. He prided himself on his instincts, the way he could size someone up with a glance, decide who belonged and who didn't. In his eyes, the world was divided into those who followed the rules and those who didn't. And tonight, as he pulled over the sleek car parked under a streetlight, he believed he knew exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. But Officer Carter's instincts had failed him before, though he rarely admitted it. There were complaints, murmurs of bias and overreach, but they had always been brushed aside. "He's doing his job," his superiors said. For Carter, it wasn't personal, it was routine. And then there was Dr. Dashay Reed. To those who knew her, she was much more than her titles or accolades. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, Dashay had learned early what it meant to stand out in a world that often refused to see her worth. Her determination was forged in classrooms where she was one of the few, in courtrooms where she had to fight twice as hard to be heard, and in a society where her achievements were often met with skepticism. Now a celebrated civil rights attorney, she had built a reputation not just for her brilliance, but for her relentless pursuit of justice. Dashay had spent years representing those without a voice. Her victories were hard-fought. Cases of wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and systematic discrimination. Each win was a step forward, but the road remained long. And yet, as she sat in her car that evening, she wasn't thinking about the cases she had won or the lives she had changed. She was thinking about the conversation she had with her mother earlier that day, about how she promised to come by and visit this weekend, about how even in her position of power, she always carried a quiet awareness of moments like this. This wasn't the first time Dashay had been pulled over. She had faced it before, the dismissive glances, the probing questions, the unspoken assumptions. But tonight felt different. She was calm and collected, but fully aware that the outcome of this encounter might not depend on her actions at all. Two individuals, both shaped by their pasts and their perceptions, now found themselves at a crossroads. For Officer Carter, it was just another stop on another night. For Dr. Reed, it was a moment she hoped would pass without incident, but prepared for nonetheless. Their worlds were about to collide in a way neither could have anticipated. It was nearing the end of a long day when Dr. Dashay Reed got behind the wheel of her car. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the quiet road ahead, and the hum of the engine was a welcome reprieve from the intensity of the day. Dashay wasn't thinking about her work or the cases piling up on her desk. She was just looking forward to the comfort of home. As she turned onto a residential street, the flash of red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips. She had checked her speed and signaled her turns. There was nothing out of the ordinary about her driving, yet there it was, the unmistakable signal to pull over. She eased the car to the curb and placed her hands on the steering wheel. Her mind was steady, her heartbeat measured, but she was no stranger to what could happen next. The officer approached slowly, his flashlight scanning the interior of her car before settling on her face. "License and registration," he said sharply. The tone carried an edge, not a question, but a demand. Deshay reached into her bag with deliberate care, retrieving her identification and registration. She handed them to him through the window. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man glanced at the documents briefly, his eyes narrowing. "Your tail light's out," he replied, though Deshay had checked her car just days before and found nothing wrong. She remained calm. "I wasn't aware of that. I'll get it checked." The officer didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice hardening. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Deshay raised her eyes to meet his. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet resolve. "I was driving home." But Officer Carter wasn't finished. He took another step forward, his flashlight now trained on the dashboard. "This your car?" he asked, the insinuation unmistakable. "Yes," Deshay replied simply, her tone unshaken. He let the silence linger as if waiting for her to say something else, something that might confirm whatever story he had already constructed in his mind. When no such confession came, he pressed further. "Nice car. Must have cost a fortune." His voice carried a note of skepticism, as though the idea of her owning such a vehicle didn't sit right with him. "What do you do for a living?" "I'm an attorney," Deshay answered, her words measured. The officer chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "An attorney," he repeated, almost as if the notion were absurd. The air between them grew heavier. Carter's questions didn't feel procedural. They felt personal. Each one carried a subtle accusation, as if her very presence here was an offense. "Mind if I take a look inside the car?" he asked, though the way he phrased it made it clear he wasn't asking. Deshay tilted her head slightly, her composure unwavering. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Carter's jaw tightened. "Are you refusing?" It was a moment charged with tension, one where every word and every gesture carried weight. For Carter, this was another routine stop, another opportunity to assert control. But for Deshay, it was a test she had faced too many times before, a test of patience, of dignity, and of her right to exist without suspicion. The sound of passing cars seemed to stretch the silence between them. Deshay's grip on the steering wheel relaxed, but her resolve only grew stronger. She knew what this was, and she knew exactly how to handle it. As Carter stepped back toward his patrol car, a faint smirk crossed his face, as though he believed he had the upper hand. But Deshay didn't flinch, didn't waver. She simply waited, knowing that this encounter was far from over. Officer Carter returned to Deshay's window, his expression unreadable but his tone sharper. "So, you're an attorney, huh?" He let the words hang in the air, his eyes scanning her once more, as if the title didn't quite match the person sitting in front of him. "Must be nice," he added, gesturing toward her car. "A ride like this doesn't come cheap." Deshay remained calm, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "I've worked hard for everything I have," she replied, her voice steady. Carter leaned in closer, the flashlight still pointed into the car. "Where do you work? What kind of attorney are you?" Deshay met his gaze, unflinching. "Civil rights," she said. For a brief moment, Carter seemed to pause, his lips pressing into a thin line, but the hesitation was fleeting. "Civil rights," he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "So, you're one of those attorneys who goes after cops, huh?" Deshay didn't answer right away. She knew what he was trying to do, push her, provoke her, make her react. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "I work to ensure everyone is treated fairly under the law," she said evenly. Carter straightened up, his flashlight moving away from her face and back toward the car's interior. "Fairly," he muttered, as though the word itself was a challenge. "Funny, I don't see too many lawyers like you around here." There it was again. The unspoken accusation, the weight of assumptions disguised as questions, but Daché remained unshaken. What would you do in her position? Would you stay silent, or would you speak up? Share your thoughts below. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment. Carter stepped back and motioned for her to step out of the car. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to exit the vehicle," he said. Daché's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "And why would that be necessary?" Carter's tone hardened. "I need to confirm there's nothing illegal in this car." Daché's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't amusement, but rather a quiet signal that she was no stranger to situations like this. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, her movements deliberate and calm. As she stood beside the car, she turned to face him fully. "Be careful, officer," she said, her voice low but firm. "You may regret how you're handling this." Carter tilted his head, his smirk returning. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," Daché said, her eyes steady on his. The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of another car pulling up. A second patrol vehicle came to a stop just behind Carter's cruiser. Another officer stepped out, this one younger, his face marked with curiosity and concern. The new officer approached cautiously, his eyes flickering between Carter and Daché. And then, as his gaze settled on Daché, recognition flashed across his face. His steps slowed, his posture straightened. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice tinged with both surprise and unease. Carter turned to him, confused. "You know her?" The younger officer nodded, his tone respectful. She's the attorney who handled the Peterson case last year, the one with the department." Carter's smirk faded instantly. His shoulders stiffened and his eyes darted back to Daché, who stood silently, her composure unbroken. The younger officer took a step closer to Carter, his voice now a whisper. "She's been on the news. She's one of the top civil rights attorneys in the state. You don't want to mess this up." Carter's face paled, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. Daché remained still, watching the exchange without saying a word. The balance of power at that moment shifted, though no one said it out loud. Carter's assumptions, his tone, his questions, all of it was now under scrutiny, and for the first time that evening he realized he wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. What happens when the person you believe you have authority over holds all the cards? For Officer Carter, the answer was beginning to unfold, and it wasn't one he was prepared for. The air felt heavy as Officer Carter stood motionless, his jaw tightening. The younger officer leaned closer, his voice low but urgent. "She's Dr. Daché Reed," he whispered, "the one who won those profiling cases last year. 3 departments had to settle because of her lawsuits." Carter's expression shifted in an instant. The confidence, the authority he had displayed just moments ago, now wavered. He glanced back at Daché, who stood calm and unwavering, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She wasn't smug, nor was she angry. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unrelenting. The younger officer took a cautious step back, giving Carter space to process what he just heard. Carter cleared his throat, but the words didn't come easily. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an awkward hesitation. Dr. Reed," he started, his voice faltering. I wasn't aware of who you were." Daché tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining unchanged. "Does it matter who I am?" she asked, her tone calm but cutting. "Would you have treated me differently if I were someone else?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he looked down, his hand tightening around the flashlight he no longer needed. I apologize," he muttered. The younger officer stood nearby, his posture tense as he watched the scene unfold. He seemed torn between respecting his superior and acknowledging the gravity of what had just happened. Daché took a step closer, her voice firm but measured. "Officer," she began, her gaze never leaving his, "do you realize how often this happens? How many people do you stop and question based not on what they've done, but on who you assume they are?" Carter looked up briefly, his face a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. He didn't answer. "You asked me what I was doing in this neighborhood," Daché continued, her voice unwavering. "You assumed this car couldn't belong to me. You assumed I didn't belong here. And now that you know my name, suddenly, your tone changes?" Carter shifted uncomfortably, his silence speaking louder than any excuse he could have offered. "Respect shouldn't be reserved for the people you think matter," Daché said. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "It should be the standard for everyone." The younger officer glanced at Carter, then back at Daché. "Dr. Reed," he said softly, "I'm sorry for what happened. I'll make sure this is noted." Daché nodded slightly but kept her attention on Carter. "This isn't about an apology," she said. "This is about accountability. You need to understand the impact of your actions, not just on me, but on every person who's been in my position without the privilege of a name you might recognize." Carter finally met her gaze. "You're right," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow, more an attempt to end the conversation than a genuine acknowledgment of his wrongdoing. Daché stepped back, her composure unbroken. "I hope this interaction makes you rethink how you treat people who look like me," she said, her voice calm but piercing. "Because next time, it might not be me standing here, and they might not have the resources to challenge you." The younger officer nodded respectfully, stepping toward Carter as if to signal that it was time to let her go. Carter gave a stiff nod, his eyes still on the ground. As Daché returned to her car, the silence was almost deafening. Carter stood motionless, his mind racing with what had just unfolded. The flashing lights dimmed, and the sound of her engine starting broke the stillness. At that moment, Officer Carter wasn't just facing Dr. Daché Reed. He was confronting his own biases, his assumptions, and the consequences of his actions. And though the interaction ended there, the impact of that night would stay with him long after the lights faded and the road grew quiet once more. The interaction between Dr. Daché Reed and Officer Carter could have ended quietly. She could have driven away, letting the encounter dissolve into memory. But Daché Reed had spent her life ensuring moments like this weren't just forgotten. They became catalysts for change. The next morning, Dr. Reed sat in her office, reviewing the events from the night before. She wrote a detailed report of the incident, including every question, every assumption, and every unwarranted demand. She knew the system well enough to understand the importance of documentation. By the afternoon, the report had reached the desk of the police chief, along with a formal complaint against Officer Carter. Daché's name carried weight, and the department was quick to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. The response, however, did not stop there. A local journalist picked up the story, recognizing Dr. Reed's name and her history of high-profile cases. Within hours, the details were public. A respected civil rights attorney was stopped and interrogated without cause, subjected to assumptions that mirrored the very injustices she fought against. The headlines hit hard. "Attorney files complaint against police for racial profiling," one article read. Another asked, "How often do incidents like this go unreported?" The department announced an internal investigation into Officer Carter's actions. He was placed on administrative leave as public pressure mounted. Statements were issued, but they offered little more than carefully crafted words of damage control. But for the community, words were not enough. The incident became a rallying point, a spark that ignited long-standing frustrations over similar encounters. Stories began to emerge, individuals coming forward with their own experiences of being stopped, questioned, and judged based solely on the color of their skin. Dr. Reed was no stranger to the public eye, but this time the spotlight was not one she sought. Still, she used it. Appearing in interviews and community forums, she spoke not just about her own experience, but about the larger issue at hand. "This isn't about me. It's about the countless individuals who face this kind of treatment every day, the people who don't have the resources or the platform to speak out. This is about creating a system that holds people accountable and ensures that respect isn't conditional." Her words resonated. The call for change grew louder. Advocacy groups joined the conversation, demanding reforms in law enforcement practices. Community leaders organized town halls, inviting police officials to engage in dialogue with the residents they served. Amid the growing momentum, Dr. Reed proposed a clear and actionable initiative: mandatory bias training for all officers in the department. She outlined a program designed not just to educate, but to challenge the deep-seated assumptions that often led to these encounters. The program gained traction, drawing support from both community leaders and progressive voices within law enforcement. It was a step, small but significant, in addressing a system that had allowed bias to thrive unchecked. As for Officer Carter, the investigation concluded with findings that confirmed what Dashay's report had detailed. He was suspended without pay and required to complete the newly implemented training before returning to duty. For Carter, the punishment was more than a professional setback. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront the very behaviors that had led him to that night on the quiet suburban street. But the story didn't end with one officer's accountability. The real victory lay in the conversations it sparked, the awareness it raised, and the systems it began to challenge. For Dashay, the night she was pulled over was just one chapter in a much larger narrative, a narrative that she and so many others were determined to rewrite. Dr. Dashay Reed's experience is not an isolated incident. It is a stark reminder of the quiet battles fought every day, often unseen and unspoken. In that moment on the side of the road, it wasn't just her identity as an attorney or her accomplishments that were on trial. It was the very notion of fairness, respect, and accountability. Her story shows us that the assumptions we carry, whether conscious or unconscious, have the power to harm. Bias isn't just a personal failing, it's a systemic issue that affects us all. And in a society that values justice, there's no room for complacency. We must ask ourselves, how many others have faced what Dr. Reed endured without the privilege of a platform to speak out? How many stories have gone untold, their lessons unrealized? Accountability is more than an apology or a suspension. It's a commitment to change, a willingness to confront the systems that allow these moments to happen, and a collective effort to ensure they don't happen again. What would you do to hold people accountable for racial profiling? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for daily news stories. Your voice matters in shaping this conversation. If this story moved you, consider sharing it to raise awareness. These conversations are the first step toward lasting change. Dr. Reed's story is a powerful example of how courage and persistence can transform injustice into action. It challenges us to think critically about the kind of society we want to live in, one where respect and dignity are not privileges but guarantees. Because justice isn't just about the laws we enforce, it's about the values we uphold.